What happened next on CNN left Dick Cheney completely speechless and may have just ended his political commentary comeback before it even started. The 83-year-old former vice president walked into that Washington studio thinking he could bulldoze Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett with decades of political experience. He launched a brutal attack on her legal background, calling her another unqualified lawyer playing politician, but Crockett hadn't come to take insults, lying down. Armed with a Harvard law degree, years of civil rights work, and razor-sharp legal mind, the 33-year-old Texas Democrat was about to deliver a masterclass in political destruction that would leave Cheney frozen in his chair and the entire room stunned into silence. Before we dive into this epic showdown, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss these incredible political moments. Comment below where you're watching from. Let's see how far this story reaches. This wasn't just a debate. This was the moment a young black woman lawyer dismantled one of the most powerful men in American political history, live on national television. And what she pulled out next left everyone in that CNN studio absolutely shocked. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know exactly who these two political heavyweights really are, and why this battle mattered so much. This is a man who served as vice president under George W. Bush for 8 years, Secretary of Defense under George H.W. Bush, and White House Chief of Staff under Gerald Ford. His resume reads like a textbook of American power: CEO of Halliburton, Wyoming congressman for a decade, and one of the architects of the Iraq War. Cheney built his reputation as the ultimate Washington insider, the man who operated behind the scenes with an iron fist. His political career spans over 4 decades, from the Nixon administration through the post-9/11 era. He's used to being the smartest guy in the room, the one who makes or breaks careers with a single word. But here's the thing about Cheney: he's also become something of a pariah in his own party. After spending years criticizing Donald Trump and supporting his daughter Liz Cheney's anti-Trump crusade, many Republicans see him as a traitor. Democrats still hate him for the Iraq War and his hardline policies. He's a man without a political home, trying to rebuild his relevance in a changed America. At just 33 years old, she represents everything Cheney's generation fought against: young, black, female, and unapologetically progressive. But don't let her age fool you. This woman has credentials that would make most lawyers jealous. Crockett graduated from Rhodes College before earning her law degree from the University of Houston Law Center. She spent years as a civil rights attorney, fighting for voting rights and criminal justice reform in Texas. She cut her teeth defending people who couldn't defend themselves, taking on powerful interests that most lawyers wouldn't dare challenge. In 2020, she won a seat in the Texas House of Representatives, where she quickly became known for her fierce questioning and ability to dismantle opponents with facts and legal precision. Then in 2022, she made the jump to Congress, representing Texas's 30th district in the U.S. House of Representatives. But Crockett isn't just another politician. She's part of a new generation of black women lawyers who refuse to be intimidated by old white men in suits. She's faced down Texas Republicans, Trump supporters, and Washington insiders. She's never backed down from a fight, and she's certainly not about to start now. Cheney represents the old system: white, male, wealthy, connected, used to being obeyed without question. Crockett represents the new generation: diverse, educated, determined to challenge every assumption and demand accountability. The setting made it even more dramatic. CNN's Washington studio, cameras rolling, millions watching at home. Cheney had agreed to this joint appearance thinking he could use his experience and gravitas to put this young congresswoman in her place. He had no idea he was walking into a trap. The topic was supposed to be about legal qualifications for political office, something Cheney felt confident discussing. After all, he'd been appointing lawyers and judges for decades. What could this young woman possibly teach him about legal credentials? He was about to find out the hard way that underestimating Jasmine Crockett was the biggest mistake of his political comeback attempt. The tension started building the moment both politicians settled into their chairs under the bright CNN studio light. Host Anderson Cooper introduced them with his usual professional tone, but you could feel the electricity in the air. This wasn't going to be a polite political discussion. His gray suit was perfectly pressed, his tie straight, every inch the embodiment of establishment power. When Cooper asked about the qualifications needed for high political office, Cheney saw his open. "Well, Anderson," Cheney began, his voice carrying that Wyoming drawl that had commanded boardrooms and situation rooms. "I think we need to be realistic about what real experience looks like in this town. I've been watching some of these newer members of Congress, and frankly, I'm concerned." He paused dramatically, his eyes shifting toward Crockett with barely concealed disdain. "Take the Congresswoman here. Sure, she's got a law degree. Lots of people have law degrees, but what has she actually done? A few years as a civil rights lawyer in Texas, a couple years in the state legislature, and now she thinks she's qualified to make decisions that affect national security, foreign policy, the economy." The studio fell quiet except for the hum of camera. Crockett sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable, but her eyes never left Cheney's face. But Cheney wasn't done. He was just getting warmed up, and his next words would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. "Look, I don't want to be unkind," he continued, though his tone suggested otherwise, "but we're talking about the difference between real-world experience and what? Defending small-time criminals and filing civil rights complaints? That's not governing, that's activism with a law degree." A few people in the studio production crew exchanged glances. This was getting personal fast. "I've worked with some of the finest legal minds in America, Supreme Court justices, attorneys general, White House counsel, and I can tell you there's a big difference between someone who's actually practiced law at the highest levels and someone who's, well, let's just say someone who's more interested in making headlines than making policy." Throughout Cheney's attack, Jasmine Crockett remained completely composed. She didn't interrupt, didn't fidget, didn't show any sign that his words were affecting her. If anything, she seemed to be taking mental notes, filing away each insult for future use. When Cooper turned to her for a response, she simply smiled, not a friendly smile, but the kind of smile a prosecutor gives a defendant who just confessed on the witness stand. "Cheney," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I appreciate you sharing your perspective on legal qualifications. It's interesting." Interpreting her calm response as weakness, Cheney decided to press his advantage. This was his fatal error. "Interesting," he scoffed. "Congresswoman, with all due respect, interesting doesn't cut it when you're dealing with matters of national importance. I've been in rooms where decisions were made that affected the lives of millions of people. I've worked with presidents, prime ministers, generals. I've helped shape foreign policy that kept America safe for decades." He leaned forward, his voice taking on a condescending tone that made several people in the studio cringe. "Your legal experience is what? Defending people who couldn't pay their speeding ticket, filing discrimination complaints? That's not the kind of legal background that prepares you for the complexities of governance. That's social work with a JD." Even the CNN crew members who had seen thousands of political interviews over the years knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. Cheney had just crossed a line that you don't cross with someone like Jasmine Crockett. Anderson Cooper, veteran journalist that he is, recognized the moment for what it was. His eyebrows raised slightly as he turned to Crockett. "Congresswoman, your response." "Mr. Cheney," she began, her voice still calm but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. Are you suggesting that civil rights law isn't real law? That defending people's constitutional rights isn't real legal work?" Before he could answer, she continued, "Because if that's your position, I think the viewers should know exactly what kind of legal work you consider legitimate. I'm saying there's a difference between local legal work and the kind of high-stakes legal and policy decisions that happen at the federal level. There's a difference between handling small cases and understanding the legal frameworks that govern international relations, national security, corporate law, at the highest levels." He gestured dismissively. "I mean, let's be honest. How many Supreme Court cases have you argued? How many international treaties have you negotiated? How many Fortune 500 companies have you represented? That's the kind of legal experience that matters in Washington." Every condescending word, every dismissive gesture, every assumption about her background, it was all ammunition for what was coming next. The irony was perfect. Here was a man who had spent decades in Washington thinking his reputation and connections made him untouchable, completely oblivious to the fact that he was facing someone who had actually mastered the law he claimed to understand. Crockett nodded slowly, as if considering his words carefully. "That's a very specific view of what constitutes valuable legal experience, Mr. Cheney. Very specific indeed." Behind the cameras, CNN producers were frantically taking notes. They could sense this was becoming something special, something that would be replayed for years to come. The tension in the studio was so thick you could cut it with a knife. She paused, and in that pause everyone in the room could sense that something big was about to happen. It was the kind of moment that separates average politicians from legendary ones, when someone decides to go for the kill shot instead of playing it safe. I'm curious though, since you're so concerned about legal qualifications and high-stakes legal work, maybe we should talk about your legal background. After all, if we're going to judge lawyers by their track record, shouldn't we examine all the lawyers in the room? The camera operators instinctively zoomed in on Cheney's face. Even they could tell this was the moment everything was about to change. His eyes widened slightly, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to show that he finally realized he might be in trouble. The temperature in the studio seemed to drop 10 degrees. Cheney's confident smirk faltered for just a moment before returning. But it was too late. The damage was done. The hunter had become the hunted, and Jasmine Crockett had him exactly where she wanted him. Anderson Cooper leaned forward in his chair, his journalistic instincts telling him he was about to witness something historic. This wasn't just another political interview anymore. This was becoming a masterclass in political warfare. What happened next will go down as one of the most devastating political takedowns in television history. Jasmine Crockett was about to deliver a masterclass in how to destroy an opponent using nothing but facts, legal precision, and perfect time. Crockett straightened in her chair, and suddenly her entire demeanor changed. The calm young Congresswoman was gone, replaced by the civil rights attorney who had spent years dismantling arguments in courtrooms across Texas. Ms. Cheney, since you've made this about legal qualifications, let's examine the facts. You mentioned Supreme Court cases. I haven't argued before the Supreme Court. That's true, but I have successfully argued before federal courts, state Supreme Courts, and appellate. I've won landmark civil rights cases that changed state law. I've secured multi-million-dollar settlements for clients whose rights were violated. Her voice gained strength with each word, but more importantly, I've actually practiced law, every single day, in courtrooms, with real clients, real cases, real consequences. She paused, letting that sink in before delivering the first devastating blow. Now, Mr. Cheney, I'm curious about your legal background. You've spent a lot of time talking about legal qualifications tonight. So tell me, and tell the American people, when exactly did you practice law? What cases did you try? What clients did you represent? The question hit Cheney like a physical blow. His confident expression cracked, and for the first time in the interview he looked genuinely uncomfortable. Well, my legal background is more focused on policy and, I'm sorry, Crockett interrupted smoothly, but that wasn't my question. You've spent the last several minutes questioning my legal qualifications, so I'm asking about yours. When did you practice law, Mr. Cheney? The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Anderson Cooper leaned forward slightly, recognizing that his guest was in serious trouble. I have a law degree from the University of Wyoming, Cheney finally said, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. That's wonderful, Crockett replied with mock enthusiasm. A law degree, I have one of those too. But again, that's not what I asked. When did you practice law? What was your legal career like before you went into politics? And Jasmine Crockett was just getting started. Let me help you out, Mr. Cheney. You graduated from law school in but instead of practicing law, you went straight into politics. You worked for Governor Warren Knowles in Wisconsin, then moved to Washington to work in the Nixon administration. You never had a legal career. You never represented clients. You never tried cases. You never did any of the things you just criticized me for not doing enough of. The room was dead silent. Every camera was focused on Cheney's face as the color drained from it. Behind the scenes, CNN's control room was in chaos. The director was frantically switching between camera angles, trying to capture every nuance of Cheney's crumbling composure. Stay on his face, he whispered into his headset. This is television gold. In the studio you could hear a pin drop. The usually bustling energy of a live television production had been replaced by an almost religious silence, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something sacred, the complete dismantling of a political legend. Crockett continued with surgical precision, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. So when you sit here and question my legal qualifications, when you dismiss my work as a civil rights attorney as social work with a JD, you're doing so as someone who has literally never practiced law a day in his life. She paused, letting the full weight of that revelation sink in. The camera caught Cheney's Adam's apple bobbing as he struggled to swallow, his mouth suddenly dry. His hands, which had been gesturing confidently just minutes before, now gripped the arms of his chair like a drowning man clinging to a life preserver. In fact, Miss Cheney, Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength, I have more courtroom experience in my little finger than you have accumulated in your entire 83 years on this earth. While you were playing political games in Washington, I was actually practicing law, winning cases, and defending the Constitution you claim to revere. Cheney, since you mentioned constitutional law and national security law, let's talk about that. You've made some very important legal decisions during your career. Decisions that had real consequences. She pulled out a small notebook, a move that sent chills through the CNN production team. They knew what was coming. During your time as vice president, you were involved in legal decisions regarding detention policies, interrogation techniques, and surveillance program. You famously championed the legal theory of the unitary executive. You argued that these policies were legally sound, constitutionally defensible. Cheney tried to interrupt. Congresswoman, those were complex national security. I'm not finished, Crockett said firmly, and something in her voice made him fall silent immediately. These weren't just policy decisions, Mr. Cheney, they were legal decisions, and they were challenged in court. Repeatedly, and you know what happened. Courts at every level, federal district courts, appellate courts, and yes, even the Supreme Court you mentioned, ruled against them, over and over again. Rumsfeld, Supreme Court ruled 8-1 that your detention policies violated due process. Rasul Volva Bush, Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that your Guantanamo policies were illegal. Hamdan Rumsfeld, Supreme Court ruled 5-3 that your military commission system violated both the Geneva Conventions and U.S. law. She looked directly at him, her eyes blazing. Should I continue? Because I can. I've got pages of Supreme Court decisions that ruled your legal theories unconstitutional. The studio was so quiet you could hear the cameras humming. Cheney sat frozen in his chair, his mouth slightly opened, completely unable to respond. So when you question my legal qualifications, Crockett continued, you're doing so as someone who not only never practiced law, but whose most significant legal theories were rejected by the very Supreme Court you claim to respect so much. Then Crockett did something that stunned everyone in the room. She got personal, but in the most professional way possible. You know what the difference is between us, Mr. Cheney? When I practiced civil rights law, I won. I won cases that protected people's voting rights. I won cases that stopped police misconduct. I won cases that ensured fair treatment under the law. My legal theories were upheld by courts. My work made people's lives better. She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on an intensity that made everyone in the studio lean in close. But it wasn't just about winning cases, Mr. Cheney. It was about understanding what the law actually means. When I represented clients whose constitutional rights were violated, I didn't just argue from political talking points. I built my arguments on decades of legal precedent, on careful constitutional analysis, on the kind of detailed legal scholarship that comes from actually practicing law. The camera captured every nuance of her expression as she continued. I've stood in front of federal judges and defended the Constitution. I've written briefs that were cited by other courts. I've built legal arguments that have become part of the permanent record of American jurisprudence. That's what real legal work looks like. She paused, her gaze never leaving Cheney's increasingly pale face. Your legal legacy is a series of Supreme Court decisions saying you were wrong. Your legal theories were used to justify torture, illegal detention, and violations of constitutional rights. And when real lawyers, practicing lawyers, courtroom lawyers like me, challenged your work, they beat you. Every single time. Anderson Cooper, despite his decades of experience managing tense interviews, found himself completely captivated by the surgical precision of Crockett's destruction. He had interviewed presidents, dictators, and world leaders, but he had never seen anything quite like this systematic dismantling of a political giant. Cheney, you said earlier that there's a difference between local legal work and high-stakes legal work. You're absolutely right, there is a difference. Local legal work is when you represent individual clients and help them navigate the legal system. High-stakes legal work is when your decisions affect millions of people and get reviewed by the Supreme Court. She paused for maximum impact. The difference is, I won my cases, you lost yours. I protected constitutional rights, you violated them. I built a legal career based on success and respect for the law. You built a political career, despite having no legal experience, and despite being repeatedly told by the highest courts in the land that your understanding of the law was wrong. The silence that followed was unlike anything anyone in that CNN studio had ever experienced. Dick Cheney, the man who had intimidated presidents and world leaders, sat completely frozen. His face was pale, his hands were shaking slightly, and for the first time in his political career, he had absolutely nothing to say. Anderson Cooper, veteran of thousands of interviews, struggled to find words. The production crew stood motionless behind the camera. Everyone in the room understood they had just witnessed something historic, the complete and total destruction of one of the most powerful men in American political history. And Jasmine Crockett sat there calmly, looking like she was just getting started. "Did you have a response to that, Miss Cheney?" she asked politely. He didn't. For the first time in his 83 years, Dick Cheney was speechless. The moment Jasmine Crockett finished speaking, you could feel the entire political world shift on its axis. What happened next wasn't just about one devastating interview. It was about the birth of a new political superstar and the final humiliation of an old guard legend. His face had gone completely pale, and his hands visibly trembled as he reached for his water glass. When Anderson Cooper tried to give him a chance to respond, Cheney could only manage a weak, "Well, those are complex issues." This man who had once been called the most powerful vice president in American history couldn't even form a complete sentence. Crockett had dismantled him so thoroughly that his legendary political instincts had completely shut down. "I think we need to go to commercial," Anderson Cooper finally said, recognizing that his guest was in complete meltdown mode. But the cameras kept rolling for a few more seconds, and viewers at home watched Dick Cheney slump in his chair like a deflated balloon. It was over, and everyone knew it. Before the CNN interview even ended, social media erupted like a volcano. The first clips hit Twitter within minutes, and the reaction was immediate and massive. "Crockett destroys Cheney" started trending within 10 minutes. "Never practiced law" followed shortly after. The hashtag "You Lost Your Cases" began spreading like wildfire as people shared clips of Crockett's devastating Supreme Court litany. The speed of the social media response was unprecedented. Within the first hour, the interview clips had been viewed over 2 million times across all platforms. TikTok users were already creating reaction videos, with young lawyers particularly vocal about Crockett's performance. "This is what we call getting lawyered," posted one recent law school graduate, adding fire emojis. Instagram stories exploded with clips of the most devastating moment. The sequence where Crockett lists the Supreme Court cases while Cheney sits frozen became an instant meme template, with users adding their own captions about times they'd been completely outmaneuvered by superior knowledge. A prominent legal commentator tweeted, "Holy sh! Jasmine Crockett just gave Dick Cheney the most brutal legal beatdown I've ever seen on television." And every word of it was true. The tweet went viral within minutes, racking up 50,000 retweets in the first hour alone. Legal experts from Harvard, Yale, and Stanford began quote tweeting with their own analysis, all confirming the accuracy of Crockett's citations and the devastating effectiveness of her argument. Another viral tweet read, "Cheney spent 20 minutes questioning her legal qualifications, and she ended it by pointing out he never practiced law and got rejected by SCOTUS repeatedly. This is what political murder looks like." The memes started flowing immediately. One showed Cheney's shocked face with the caption, "When you realize you just brought a knife to a Supreme Court decision fight." Another featured Crockett with the text, "Civil rights lawyer versus guy who never practiced law, winner obvious." Facebook groups, dedicated to legal humor, shared the clips with captions, like when someone without legal experience tries to lecture an actual lawyer. The posts were generating thousands of comments, with lawyers sharing their own stories of similar professional takedown. Perhaps even more significant than the social media explosion was the reaction from the legal community. Lawyers across the political spectrum began weighing in, and their response was overwhelming. Jasmine Crockett had just delivered one of the most precise and devastating legal arguments they had ever seen. Harvard law professor Lawrence Tribe tweeted, "Congresswoman Crockett's takedown of Cheney was a masterclass in legal argumentation. Every claim was precise, every citation was accurate, and the logic was flawless. This is what happens when a real lawyer faces someone who only plays one on TV." Even conservative legal scholars had to acknowledge the power of Crockett's argument. A former Bush administration lawyer posted, "I disagree with Crockett on policy, but her legal argument tonight was devastating and accurate." Cheney walked into that one. The American Bar Association's Twitter account posted a thread breaking down each of the Supreme Court cases Crockett mentioned, confirming that every single citation was correct and contextually accurate. When lawyers fact-check lawyers on live TV, they wrote, "Precision Matt, Jasmine Foyas got every detail right. Jasmine Crockett just showed America what real legal expertise looks like." Progressive organizations were even more excited. Justice Democrats tweeted, "This is why we support candidates like Jasmine Foyas. She didn't just win this debate. She exposed decades of Republican hypocrisy about qualifications and experience." But perhaps most telling was the reaction from Republicans. Many simply stayed silent, recognizing that there was no defending Cheney's performance. A few tried to argue that his government experience was more valuable than courtroom experience, but those arguments fell flat when legal experts pointed out that government lawyers still need to, understand the law. One Republican strategist privately told reporters, "That was a disaster. You can't question someone's legal qualifications when you've never practiced law yourself. And you definitely can't do it to someone who clearly knows more about constitutional law than you." Conservative media outlets found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't defend Cheney's performance because it was indefensible. They couldn't attack Crockett's arguments because they were factually accurate. And they couldn't ignore the story because it was dominating every news cycle. Fox News initially tried to frame it as heated exchange between political opponents, but even their anchors seemed uncomfortable with that spin. When legal experts confirmed that Crockett's Supreme Court citations were all correct, the narrative shifted to focus on Cheney's decades of public service, rather than his legal qualification. Some conservative commentators tried a different approach, arguing that practical political experience was more valuable than legal expertise. But this backfired when Democratic surrogates pointed out that Crockett had both successful legal experience and elected office experience. For Dick Cheney personally, the aftermath was brutal. This was supposed to be his political comeback moment, his chance to reassert his relevance in the Trump era. Instead, it became a public humiliation that effectively ended any hope of a return to political prominence. Within days, several planned media appearances were quietly canceled. A scheduled speech at a Republican fundraiser was postponed indefinitely. Even his daughter Liz Cheney, herself no stranger to political combat, reportedly told friends that her father had walked into a buzz. More damaging than the immediate humiliation was the long-term impact on Cheney's legacy. For decades he had been seen as a master of political combat, someone who could destroy opponents with his superior knowledge and experience. Crockett had shattered that image completely. Political historians began discussing the interview as a watershed moment, the night when the old guard finally met their match in the new generation of politicians. Cheney represented everything that was wrong with the old Republican establishment, wrote one analyst. Crockett showed what happens when that establishment faces someone who actually knows what they're talking about. Her congressional office was flooded with interview requests from major networks. Speaking invitations poured in from law schools, civil rights organizations, and Democratic groups across the country. But perhaps more importantly, her fundraising exploded. Small-dollar donations flooded in from across the country, with many donors specifically mentioning the Cheney interview. "I've never donated to a politician before," read one typical message, "but after watching you destroy Dick Cheney with facts and logic, I had to contribute." Democratic leadership took notice immediately. Within a week, Crockett was invited to join several high-profile committees, and was being discussed as a potential candidate for Senate or even higher office in the future. Beyond the immediate political ramifications, the Crockett-Cheney confrontation represented something much larger, a changing of the guard in American politics. For too long, political debates had been dominated by old white men who relied on their reputations and connections, rather than actual expertise. Crockett showed that the new generation of politicians, younger, more diverse, more educated, wasn't going to be intimidated by past reputations. They were going to demand that political leaders actually know what they're talking about. Legal educators began using the interview as a teaching tool, showing law students how to construct devastating arguments using precise citations and logical progression. "This is what legal advocacy looks like," one professor told his class. Every claim supported by evidence, every argument building on the last one, every conclusion inevitable. 6 months later, the Crockett-Cheney interview is still being discussed in political science and law school classes across the country. It's been viewed over 50 million times across various platforms, making it one of the most watched political interviews in recent history. More importantly, it changed how political debates are conducted. Candidates now come much better prepared, knowing that a single factual error or unsupported claim could lead to viral humiliation. The era of getting by on reputation alone is over. For Jasmine Crockett, the interview established her as one of the most effective communicators in the Democratic Party. She's become the go-to person for legal and constitutional issues, and her opinions are sought on everything from Supreme Court nominations to civil rights legislation. Dick Cheney, meanwhile, has largely retreated from public life. The man who once shaped American foreign policy now rarely gives interviews, and when he does, he sticks carefully to prepared talking points. The spontaneous combativeness that once made him feared has been replaced by obvious caution. It was about competence triumphing over reputation, preparation defeating assumption, and the new generation proving they belonged at the highest levels of American politics. Crockett didn't just win a debate, she delivered a masterclass in how to use legal expertise, factual precision, and perfect timing to dismantle an opponent completely. She showed that in the age of social media and instant fact-checking, you can't rely on old tricks and intimidation tactics. Most importantly, she proved that when you come for someone's qualifications, you better make sure your own house is in order. Because if it's not, you might find yourself frozen in your chair, speechless, while a 33-year-old civil rights lawyer from Texas schools you on constitutional law in front of the entire nation. That's what real legal expertise looks like. And that's why you should subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because we'll continue bringing you the moments when preparation meets opportunity and changes everything. Drop a comment below and let us know what was your favorite moment from Crockett's devastating takedown. We'll see you in the next video where we break down what this means for the future of American politics.